The champagne flute paused midway to Bette Davis's lips, not because the drink was too strong or the conversation too boring, but because she'd just realized that the young woman everyone was fawning over across the room was about to become a problem that needed solving. March 15th, 1955. The Beverly Hills Hotel. The Polo Lounge was packed with Hollywood's elite celebrating the success of the Academy Awards ceremony from the night before. Studios were throwing parties, agents were making deals, and stars were basking in the afterglow of another Oscar season. Bette Davis sat at her usual corner table, watching the room, with the calculating gaze of a woman who'd been Hollywood royalty for 20 years. At 47, she was still one of the most powerful actresses in the industry, a two-time Oscar winner who'd earned her reputation through talent, determination, and an absolute refusal to let anyone diminish her status. Across the room, surrounded by a crowd of admirers, stood Audrey Hepburn, 25 years old, impossibly elegant in a simple black dress and pearls, fresh off her Oscar win for Roman Holiday, with Sabrina already in theaters, and proving she wasn't just a one-hit wonder. Everyone in the room was talking about her, predicting she'd be the next great Hollywood legend. And Bette Davis couldn't stand it. It wasn't personal animosity exactly. Bette had never even met Audrey properly, but she'd been watching this newcomer's career with growing irritation, seeing something that offended her deepest beliefs about what acting should be. Audrey Hepburn was successful not because she'd earned it through years of struggle and craft development, but because she was charming and photogenic and made audiences feel good. She was everything that was wrong with modern Hollywood: style over substance, beauty over talent, marketing over merit. Bette had started as a contract player at Universal, been fired, worked her way back up through sheer determination and relentless improvement of her craft. She'd fought studio executives who wanted to typecast her, directors who underestimated her, and audiences who weren't always ready for the complex, difficult women she portrayed. She'd made herself indispensable through talent, pure, undeniable talent. And now this Belgian dancer with the big eyes and the finishing school manners was being hailed as the future of cinema. Miss Davis, a young studio executive, had approached her table, clearly nervous about interrupting her private thoughts. "Would you like to meet Miss Hepburn? I could arrange an introduction." Bette looked across the room again. Audrey was laughing at something William Wyler was saying, her hand resting lightly on the director's arm. Graceful, natural, seemingly unaware of the effect she had on everyone around her. "Yes," Bette said, setting down her champagne. "I think it's time we met." The walk across the Polo Lounge took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a march to battle. Conversations quieted as Bette moved through the room. Everyone recognized her distinctive stride, the way she carried herself like a queen entering her throne room. By the time she reached Audrey's circle, the entire lounge was watching. "Miss Hepburn," Bette said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Bette Davis." Audrey turned, and for a moment Bette saw something she hadn't expected in those famous eyes. Not fear or intimidation, but genuine pleasure. "Miss Davis," Audrey said, extending her hand gracefully. "What an honor. I've admired your work since I was a girl. All About Eve is one of the most brilliant performances I've ever seen." It was the perfect response. Respectful, but not fawning. Professional, but warm. Exactly what anyone would expect from someone with Audrey's reputation for grace and diplomacy. And it made Bette even angrier. "How kind," Bette said, not taking the offered hand, "but though I have to say I've been watching your recent work with great interest. Roman Holiday. Sabrina. Quite the meteoric rise." The tone was carefully neutral, but everyone in the room could hear the edge underneath. William Wyler stepped slightly closer to Audrey, sensing trouble. Other members of their group began to look uncomfortable. "I've been very fortunate," Audrey replied carefully. "Wonderful directors, wonderful scripts. I know how rare that is." "Fortunate," Bette repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, that's certainly one way to describe it." The room was completely quiet now. 50 of Hollywood's most powerful people had stopped their conversations to watch this encounter between the reigning queen of dramatic acting and cinema's newest darling. "Miss Davis," Audrey said quietly, "is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" That was the moment Bette Davis made the mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Instead of making some diplomatic comment and walking away, instead of keeping her criticism private or professional, she decided to say exactly what she thought about Audrey Hepburn's place in Hollywood. "I've been wondering," Bette said, her voice getting louder, more theatrical, "when exactly Hollywood decided that being photogenic was the same thing as being able to act." The silence that followed was absolute. Not just the absence of conversation, but the kind of silence that comes when everyone in a room realizes they're about to witness something they'll never forget. Audrey's face didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't look around for support, didn't show any sign that she'd just been insulted in front of the most important people in her industry. She just looked at Bette Davis with those enormous eyes and waited. "Because that seems to be the trend lately," Bette continued, emboldened by Audrey's silence. "Pretty girls with accents and good bone structure being handed leading roles that should go to actresses. Real actresses, women who've actually learned their craft instead of just learning how to pose for photographers." William Wyler stepped forward. "Betty, that's enough." "Is it?" Betty turned to include the entire group in her performance. "Are we all going to pretend that what's happened here represents some kind of artistic achievement? This girl hasn't paid her dues. She hasn't earned her place. She's been given everything because she photographs well and makes men feel protective." Audrey still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. She stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her, looking like she was listening to someone give directions to the nearest post office. "She's not an actress," Bette said finally, her voice carrying across the entire lounge. "She's a model who memorizes lines. And the fact that audiences can't tell the difference says more about the sorry state of American taste than it does about her talent." The attack was devastating, public, and designed to humiliate. Bette had used her status, her reputation, and her commanding presence to destroy a younger rival in front of everyone who mattered in Hollywood. It should have worked. Audrey should have been reduced to tears, should have fled the room in shame, should have been marked as someone who couldn't hold her own against Hollywood's established stars. Instead, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Audrey Hepburn smiled. Not the polite, diplomatic smile she'd been wearing all evening, a different smile. Sadder, more knowing, but also somehow more powerful. "Miss Davis," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Bette, caught off guard by the calm response, nodded. "Do you remember what it was like when you were 25? The question was so unexpected that Bette actually blinked. "What? When you were my age? When you were just starting out? Do you remember what it felt like to have people question whether you belonged in this business?" Audrey took a small step closer, and somehow the movement changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "Because I imagine it was difficult. I imagine you had to prove yourself over and over again. I imagine there were people who said you weren't pretty enough or charming enough or that you didn't fit what audiences wanted to see." Bette's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "And I imagine," Audrey continued, her voice still soft but carrying clearly through the silent room, "that it must have been especially difficult when other women who should have understood what you were going through, decided that you were competition rather than a colleague." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the room could feel the shift, could sense that something fundamental had changed in the power dynamic between these two women. "You're absolutely right that I haven't paid the same dues you have," Audrey said. "You've worked for 20 years to build your reputation. You've fought for every role, every opportunity. You've proven yourself in ways I haven't had to, and I have enormous respect for that achievement." She paused, looking directly into Bette's eyes. "But Miss Davis, I don't think the solution to the challenges you've faced is to make sure other women face the same challenges. I think the solution is to build an industry where talent is recognized and developed, regardless of how long it takes or where it comes from." Audrey glanced around the room, taking in the faces of directors, producers, and fellow actors who were hanging on every word. "You say I haven't earned my place. Maybe you're right, but if that's true, then help me earn it. Teach me what you know. Share what you've learned, because the alternative, tearing down other women to protect your own position, doesn't make you stronger. It just makes all of us weaker." The room was so quiet that the sound of someone setting down a glass at the bar seemed loud as thunder. "I came into this business because I love acting," Audrey continued. "Not because I wanted to be famous or wealthy or admired. Because I wanted to tell stories that matter. Stories about human beings struggling with complex emotions and difficult choices. The same kinds of stories you've been telling for 20 years. She smiled again, and this time it was warm, genuine. "So if you're willing to help me become the kind of actress who deserves to tell those stories, I would be honored to learn from you. But if you'd rather use your talent and experience to diminish other people's opportunities, then I think we have very different ideas about what this business should be." Audrey extended her hand again. "What do you say, Miss Davis? Colleagues?" The entire room held its breath. 50 of the most powerful people in Hollywood waited to see how one of their industry's most legendary figures would respond to being publicly schooled in grace and dignity by a 25-year-old newcomer. Bette Davis stared at the offered hand for what felt like an eternity. Her face showed a succession of emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally something that might have been respect. Slowly, she reached out and shook Audrey's hand. "Colleagues," she said quietly. The applause that erupted was spontaneous and sustained, not just polite recognition of a diplomatic moment, but genuine appreciation for having witnessed something remarkable. A public confrontation that could have turned ugly had been transformed into something else entirely. But more importantly, the dynamic between Bette Davis and Audrey Hepburn had been permanently altered. Instead of established star versus threatening newcomer, they'd become something unprecedented in Hollywood, senior colleague and junior colleague, with mutual respect replacing competitive animosity. The rest of the evening continued, but everyone knew they'd witnessed something significant. Not just a clash between two actresses, but a demonstration of how power could be shared rather than hoarded, how conflicts could be resolved through wisdom rather than dominance. 2 weeks later, Bette Davis called William Wyler with an unusual request. She wanted to recommend Audrey Hepburn for a supporting role in her next film, a dramatic piece that would require exactly the kind of serious acting Bette claimed Audrey couldn't do. "Are you sure about this?" Wyler asked. "I want to see what she's really made of," Bette replied. "If she's as good as she claims to be, she'll hold her own. If she's not, it'll be obvious." The film was never made. Studio politics intervened, but the offer became Hollywood legend. Bette Davis, who never shared the spotlight with anyone, had been willing to work with the actress she'd publicly dismissed just weeks earlier. Years later, when both women were established icons, a reporter asked Bette about that night at the Beverly Hills Hotel. "I learned something important," Bette said. "I learned that there's a difference between protecting your territory and building a legacy. Audrey understood that difference better than I did." "Do you regret what you said to her?" Bette considered the question carefully. "I regret the way I said it. But I don't regret that it happened, because what came after, the conversation we had, the way she responded, that taught me more about real strength than 20 years in this business." "What do you mean?" "Real strength isn't about proving you're tougher than everyone else. It's about making everyone around you stronger. Audrey showed me that. She turned what could have been a humiliation into an opportunity for both of us to grow." Audrey, for her part, never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked about her relationship with Bette Davis, she would always say, "Miss Davis is one of the finest actresses of her generation. I've learned so much from watching her work." But privately to close friends, she would occasionally reference that night as a turning point in her understanding of what it meant to be a professional woman in a competitive industry. "I realized that evening that you have two choices when someone tries to diminish you," she told Mel Ferrer years later. "You can try to prove they're wrong by attacking back, or you can try to prove they're wrong by being better than they expect. The second way is harder, but it's the only way that actually changes anything." The confrontation between Bette Davis and Audrey Hepburn became part of Hollywood mythology, but not for the reasons anyone expected. It wasn't remembered as a catfight between rival actresses, or as an example of the industry's cutthroat nature. It was remembered as the night that showed what was possible when someone chose grace over retaliation, wisdom over defensiveness, collaboration over competition. And it became a template for how conflicts between women in Hollywood could be resolved, not by determining who was stronger or more talented, but by finding ways to make both parties more successful. The lesson lasted. For the rest of their careers, both women were known for mentoring younger actresses rather than seeing them as threats. They'd learned that in an industry built on insecurity and competition, the most radical act was choosing to lift others up instead of tearing them down. That night at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Bette Davis had intended to put a presumptuous newcomer in her place. Instead, she'd discovered that sometimes the newcomer knows something the veteran has forgotten. That real power doesn't announce itself with attacks. It announces itself with an invitation to do better, together.